The secret is out, or part of it at least, a Senate panel publishing some but not all of its report on the CIA's use of torture after the September 11th attacks of 2001. The conclusion's damning: how intelligence services misled the White House with interrogations more brutal than depicted and methods such as waterboarding that in fact yielded precious little information. Anticipating a hostile reaction, the U.S. stepping up security at embassies abroad. So what will be the fallout from this report? Should the Senate have heeded the call of those against the publication? They include not only Republicans, but the likes of U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry. More broadly, how far can spies in the name of national interest or security go? And how much does spying today rely on interrogation? Today in the France 24 debate, we're asking if there is a license to torture. With us from Washington, Alka Pradhan. She's a counter-terrorism counsel for Reprieve. Tell us what Reprieve is.
Reprieve is an international human rights NGO. It is based in London, and we now have Reprieve US here in New York and Washington, D.C. I'm the D.C.-based attorney for Reprieve. We represent both detainees, current and former, at Guantanamo Bay, and several of our clients were subjected to torture either by the CIA or by the U.S. Armed Forces, and so we have been reading this report with great interest this morning. And we'll also be talking about it with former CIA officer Jean Arthur Coyle, who teaches in the School of Global and International Studies at the University of Indiana. Welcome back to the show, sir.
Thank you.
Let's welcome as well Régis Le Sommier, Deputy Editor-in-Chief of French news weekly Paris Match. Welcome as well.
Thank you.
And Régis, there is a life, by the way, after journalism. We've discovered it because Lana Kamouri, formerly of France 24 fame, now international law scholar. Welcome.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's good to be back, Francois.
Good to have you. The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation, and you have on Facebook and Twitter, our hashtag F2ForDebate. Just a few short hours ago, that report was unveiled by the chair of that U.S. Senate panel, Democrat Dianne Feinstein.
It shows that the CIA's actions a decade ago are a stain on our value and on our history. The release of this 500-page summary cannot remove that stain, but it can and does say to our people and the world that America is big enough to admit when it's wrong and confident enough to learn from its mistakes. Releasing this report is an important step to restore our values and show the world that we are, in fact, a just and lawful society.
First of all, do you agree with that point, Lana Kamouri, that it was a good idea to release?
I tend to agree. It might be a risky idea. As we've seen today, the U.S. has decided to reinforce security around American embassies around the world to cater to possibly increased risk, but it's definitely better than keeping it under wraps, and it is brave to a certain extent to choose to make this report public, at least most of it public, part of it's still redacted.
Part of it's still redacted. Jean Arthur Coyle, now that it's out, how do you feel about it?
I think the first thing I'd like to raise is to point out that this is a report done entirely by the Democratic members of that committee. The Republicans refused to participate in it. Therefore, I question whether just because it winds up in Senator Feinstein's report, if that is true, and particularly the parts about that nothing of value was gained. That has been refuted by a number of people who were involved in the interrogations.
Well, tell us your personal experience on that, Jean Arthur Coyle. Interrogations, do they work?
If I am to believe President Bush, Vice President Cheney, former CIA Chief of Operations Jose Rodriguez, they say that very useful information came out of the interrogations. Now, granted, they have their personal bias, perhaps, is why they want to believe that. But then so do the Democrats, such as Senator Feinstein. It's sort of a sad commentary of how politicized the American Congress has gotten. My own experience, I was never directly involved in them, but hearing from friends, acquaintances who were more involved, they say, yes, we got useful information out of it. You're all entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own facts. So we have a great dilemma here of who to believe. Was it useful or not useful?
Alka Pradhan, what have you learned from looking at these 500 pages that were published?
Well, I have to say, I have to dispute what Mr. Coyle said. This was a document-based review. Everything that is in that report is from documents. It's actually not opinions. It's from CIA documents, whatever records they did keep, because apparently they did not keep very detailed records regarding the detainees that they held at these sites. The fact that the Republicans didn't participate is a testament to the fact that the Republicans had the most to lose by putting this in the public record. The people mentioned, President Bush, Dick Cheney, Jose Rodriguez, people like that who authorized the techniques, first of all, they have owned it. They have said, absolutely, we tortured, and then they're proud of that. What they have not done is actually show in any real or detailed way how any of those torture techniques led to actionable intelligence. On the contrary, we have actually proven many times over that the intelligence gain that led to Osama bin Laden and to other key al-Qaeda targets were not gained from torture. What we find, actually, from the CIA documents themselves is that the torture actually led to a decrease in actionable intelligence from these men. So what we've learned from this report now is partially what we knew all along, is that since the CIA tortured, it was wrong. They had no idea what they were doing in interrogation because the CIA is not trained to interrogate. And not just that, but it was far more brutal and far less effective than anyone could have dreamed.
Régis Le Sommier, take us back to 2001 when these so-called enhanced interrogations began.
Well, take us back, I mean, to the to go in favor of the CIA. One must admit that at the time, the CIA was very, very backwards in knowing the enemy, basically knowing who attacked America, and so they had to rush in order to face this new enemy. So in a way, that could explain why the Bush administration let loose on all those values, let's say, and authorized things that are not constitutional or are outside the American Constitution, including Guantanamo Bay, and I think what's healthy when you read that document released today is that America is a democracy, is a functioning democracy, because it's able to not correct this mistake, but to admit some of them and to make a broad consensus, basically, because that committee studied for a long time, redacted some parts, of course, but basically we have now
Redacted means kept them secret.
Yeah, so some of them. But what we know, for instance, is that there were some actual lies especially from Dick Cheney's part, but using the piece on Sheikh Khalid Mohammed, the fact that he was waterboarding over 100 times, and that actually produced material that led to bin Laden, and that was wrong. Apparently, that's what the report says today. So there has been some manipulation. Now that America is coming and at terms with that, and that America is looking at itself and say, we did that was not part of our value, I think is a real strength of the country.
When you look at the details, and of course, the waterboarding of the so-called mastermind of the September 2011 attacks, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, what's your reaction?
The first thing to point out, there was a debate for many years about whether waterboarding constituted torture or not. There was a lot of trying to hedge around this notion. And the first thing that I think needs to be acknowledged is that waterboarding does amount to torture and is unlawful under international law. It's also unlawful under the US Constitution and American law. Number one. The second thing is the CIA today insists in the statement published right after the report was released that perhaps not the waterboarding of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but enhanced interrogation techniques, so to speak, in other words, a euphemism for torture, did produce valuable leads towards Osama bin Laden. In a sense, this is an unknowable fact. As was pointed out earlier, many of the records were lost. It will be impossible to really find out ultimately whether this did happen or not. But what does matter is the step that the administration has taken in making this report mostly public.
And of course, the difficulty, as Jean Arthur Coyle was pointing out earlier, is we're talking about things that are still classified, such as when Senator Feinstein says that there was no plots foiled because of these so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. Back in 2007, then President George W. Bush defended the methods employed after 9/11.
In the war on terror, intelligence is one of the most crucial tools for our defense. If a captured terrorist has information about a plot against our homeland, we need to know what he knows.
The former head of the CIA, George Tenet, saying it was a ticking time bomb every day. Jean Arthur Coyle, what was it like in those days after 9/11?
Well, everyone felt guilty at the CIA that this happened. The CIA was created in 1947 coming out of the Pearl Harbor attacks, and it was to prevent another massive surprise attack. No one at the working level in the CIA cared why it might have happened or not happened. It's just that we did let it happen. The American public wanted to make sure that nothing further happened of that nature. And a lot of people were out for revenge. And the CIA was told, go find who did this and make sure it doesn't happen again. That was the mentality within the building.
I think it was even worse because the CIA was blamed from 9/11. And I think they probably try to catch up and do their best and actually produce sources, leads that could lead to terrorists. So I think that there was a rush at that time. I agree with that.
If I may add something to that, the report also says that a huge proportion of interrogation was outsourced to private contractors. I think that's a very interesting point. I think, if I remember correctly, it was something like 73% of those interrogations were not conducted by American officials, but by private contractors. That's also perhaps a symptom of the haste that you're talking about, of the state of panic, but also really an interesting question regarding responsibility for these actions and who's going to bear that responsibility.
All right, a reaction on Twitter. The CIA should use better methods for interrogations against the prisoners, not the violence. Jean Arthur Coyle, on that point, did it show up, 9/11, that the CIA basically was not prepared? You just heard Lana Camorier talk about the outsourcing of these interrogations.
Well, through the 1990s, once the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold Wars ended, both the U.S. military and the CIA took about a 30% budget cut and personnel cut. Then the same senators and congressmen who'd authorized those peace dividend cuts after 9/11 said, why was the CIA asleep and let this happen?
Alka Pradhan, your thoughts?
Well, absolutely. I think that there was a great deal of pressure on the CIA post 9/11 because, and this has been documented, there were significant intelligence gaps between what the CIA knew, what the FBI knew, and the fact that they weren't talking to each other, along with several of the other agencies. So certainly there was pressure. And I participated last year in a bipartisan study of detention operations post-2001. And the first thing we acknowledged was that post-September 11th, the country was in a state of crisis. We absolutely acknowledge that. That said, the fact that the CIA held 119 detainees at black sites, tortured those people, and 26 of them at least were not even meant to be detained, did not even meet the threshold for detention. And this was not just immediately post-September 11th, but from basically immediately after September 11th through early 2008, over a period of 7 years. That, to me, is absolutely unacceptable, and it sort of is a window into how we allowed our fears to completely destroy our values.
Regis Sommier, there was, of course, the scandal that broke out when there were those pictures that were leaked at Baghdad's Abu Ghraib prison. It showed basically, but this wasn't the CIA, this was the U.S. Army in this case, wasn't up to the task at hand.
Well, I think there was the problem with Abu Ghraib and generally with the detainee system in Iraq is that it was hugely influenced by Guantanamo own system. And actually the general who created Guantanamo was sent to Iraq back then in order to actually replicate or sort of adapt the techniques and methods used in Guantanamo to Iraq. And one of the consequence of that was the jamming of the Abu Ghraib prison, meaning like every, some units, I remember the 3rd Infantry Division had very terrible records of wrapping up every Iraqi man in the street from 15 years to 40 who looked suspicious and sent it to prison. So that jamming of the system was one thing. And then
Because that wasn't the CIA.
No, that wasn't the CIA. But who was in charge of Abu Ghraib? The National Guard. And you take people like Linda England or her higher ups. I mean, people who were at the detention center. These were people that were coming from we nicknamed the National Guard the weekend soldiers, because they have very poor training, and all of a sudden there's a war and they're being sent to take care of a detainee center. And at that time, the CIA officer was telling them to soften the detainees. What they were poor kids, brought from the middle of America, sent to a prison jail, with 9/11 in mind. Soften the detainees. For them,
What does that mean,
terrorists.
soften the detainees?
Like, before they're being interrogated, prepare them for being interrogated and in order to talk. That is what happened. What has been called at Abu Ghraib was a total dereliction of duty. It was something terrible because some people who were not formed nor trained were in charge of detainees, and that was for the purpose of intelligence officer who after that would carry the interrogation. That was how the Abu Ghraib system worked. So it's not surprising that such thing and terrible mistakes were made back then.
All right, so scrambling for a game plan at the time is one of the things we're discovering. Stay with us. There's more to come here in the France 24 debate.